Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello class. Good morning everyone. And how are you today? I hope you fine. Okay. The title of presentation my group Contemporary English Islamic School Social Movement and Democracy in Indonesia. My name Alfian Fadillah and my friend Dea Labita Safina, Fathiya Zahraturramadhani, Affan Yazidur Rahman. Okay, next slide. Even in the early 2000s, guys, all of our nation, 47,000 Islamic school. Just a few years earlier, in the late 1918, the state Islamic university system initiated curricular reform that transformed it into one of the most forward-looking in the entire Muslim world. In the 1990, students and faculty from the same system played a proud role in Indonesia democracy movement, one of the largest the Muslim world has ever seen, following the collapse of President Suharto's New Order regime. However, radical Islamic paramilitary with ties to the conservative Islamic boarding school sprung up cities and towns across the country. Concerned about the political disposition of the country, Islamic schools were further heightened with the 2002 bombings of a beachfront pub in South Bali, in which more than if Muslim people perished, most of them Western tourists. The present chapter aims to address the question of how one of the most forward-looking Islamic education systems in the world has also given rise to a small but militant frank imperial nation, continuing transition from 32 years of authoritarian rule. I begin this chapter then with a brief overview of the variety of Islamic school in Indonesia. The section also addresses the question of how it came to be that, unlike their counterparts in so many Muslim nations, the majority of Islamic schools volunteered to open their curriculum to general or secular education, in addition to religious study. The chapter then turns to examine the recent appearance of a new breed of Islamic school of a social movement nature. By social movement school, I refer to educational institutions that aim not merely to impart knowledge and values to children, but to use the network and perceptual frames that religious education provide to challenge the existing organization of state and society. Meanwhile, as I discuss in the final section of this chapter, the mainstream educational landscape has been swept by a development that dwarfed the activity of the radical right. The coexistence of democratic and Shari'a-minded commitment in Muslim educational circle of not paradoxical at its first appears, since more educators have an ethically abstract and procedurally gradualist understanding of just how the law should be implemented. Nonetheless, the interplay of democratic and Shari'a idealism continued raise question and generate attention. The conclusion suggests that the primary question with which mainstream Muslim education will grapple in years to come is not radicalization, but how to balance the ideal of democracy with the ethical imperative of good. Variety of Islamic education. For the better parts of a century, Islamic education in Indonesia has had the three primary institutional channels. First, pengajian Quran, basic instruction in learning to read and recite but not literally understand the Quran. 2. Study at a pesantren or pondok, Islamic boarding school for students aspiring to intermediate or advanced facility in Islamic tradition of knowledge. 3. Enrollment in madrasah. In Indonesia, modern day school that use grade class textbooks and salaried instruction to provide a mix of religious and general education. As elsewhere in Southeast Asia, pengajian Quran is the oldest and most elementary form of Islamic schooling, often only likely institutionalized. Quranic study usually takes place not in a freestanding school building, but in village mosque, prayer house, and the private homes of community religion teachers. Has a schedule that changes Quranic study is not a substitute for general education, but a complement. For many of these children, pengajian provided a complementary benefit. It introduced students to the modified Arabic script known as Jawi, once used across Muslim Southeast Asia. Although Quranic recitation did not teach students to understand Arabic, then it did provide some with an alphabetic facility with some additional training might be applied to other literacy texts. Today, as in the late 19th century, many students interested in advanced Islamic learning, namely enrolling in an Islamic boarding school atau pesantren. The pesantren is dedicated to the study and transmission of the Islamic science, including knowledge of the Quran and Hadith, jurisprudence, Arabic grammar, principle of religions, the source of the law, didactic, didactic theology, and mysticism. Today, the majority of Santri students devote just a few years to their religious study, usually after first completing elementary or middle school. This short period, this short period of study, however, is not sufficient to qualify as a religious scholar. Today, some traditional pesantren still provide instruction in this loosely structured manner, and in this sense, the tradition of the peripatetic peripatetic religious study is not entirely dead. In the early 20th century, however, many pesantren introduced grade class and formal certification into parts of their curriculum.
Institution which comes to serve as the largest leg of Islamic schooling in today's Indonesia, the madrasah. Contrary to its usage in the classical Middle East in Indonesia, the term madrasah refers not to an institution of advanced religious learning, but to a primary or secondary Islamic school that combines graded instruction in general secular subjects with religious instruction. In the late 19th century, many traditionalist scholars from Java had been introduced to madrasah education while studying in Mecca. After returning to Java, some introduced elements of madrasah pedagogy into their pesantrens, including graded classes and the simultaneous study of several subjects rather than the sequential study of individual kitabs. The quiet borrowing of madrasah instructional methods into the pesantren curriculum was but one of the reforms that were to reshape Indonesian traditionalist school, also characterized by new group scholars as a backward-looking and unchanging. Over the course of the century, the traditionalists re-evaluated and reformed the school, thereby securing the school's central position in Islamic learning. Reproduction through educational change. The Indonesian pesantren has been more successful at maintaining in its central place in Islamic education than have its counterparts in the Malay Peninsula, southern Thailand, and Cambodia. Muslims in these latter regions had boarding schools, pondok, similar in organization and ambition to Indonesian pesantrens. The primary object of study in this boarding school was also the yellow text or kitab kuning studied in the Indonesian pesantren. The key to the Indonesian pesantren's dynamism has been its directors' willingness to borrow from other school systems while maintaining a commitment to the study of classical religious texts. The first of the pesantren's reform was the above-mentioned introduction of the madrasah style classroom and grading into the pesantren, a change that began in a few institutions in Java during the 1970s and 1920s. Over the next half-century, two others transformed the pesantren: the opening of advanced study to women and the incorporation of general or secular content into the school complex curriculum. Educating women. Until the 19th girls participate in pengajian Quran and other elementary forms of religious study, but they were barred from the pesantrens where students were provided with intermediate and advanced study in the Islamic science. Religious scholarship was regarded as a male profession. In the 1910s, the ban on women from intermediate and advanced Islamic education began to be lifted, as madrasah were established in West Sumatra and Java that offered religious education for young women. Several pesantrens followed suit in the late 1920s and 1930s, although at first they continued to begin behind boys-girls enrollment grew steadily in the late colonial and early independence period, accommodating the secular. The second major reform of Islamic education, the incorporation of general or secular educational materials into the curriculum, took place in a gradualist manner. Young groups schools in West Sumatra and South Central Java led the way in the change introduction mathematics, history, English, and science into the curriculum in the 1910s. The first change national sense and continued to press pesantren to accommodate general educational subjects in the curriculum in the 1915s. The newly independent government Indonesia launched an ambitious program of teacher training and mass education, ending educational dualism. In 1975, the trend toward greater pesantren involvement in general education was given institutional impetus with the signing of a ministerial memorandum that stipulated that all students in Muslim schools should receive a general elementary education of at least 6 years, in addition to the religious studies, known as the Three Minister Joint Agreement SKB 3 Menteri. The government provided incentives in support of the memorandum recommendation if offered modest funding to participating schools, and far more significant, promised that students who fulfilled general education requirements could sit for college entrance examination. The hope was that this measure would end once and for all educational dualism that had long excluded the graduates of Muslim schools from non-Islamic institutions of higher learning. The Salaf Revival. More traditionalist pesantren up to ignore the terms of the memorandum entirely because the directors at the institution were not interested in incorporating any general subject matter into their curriculum. As with the famous pesantren Lirboyo in Kediri, Java, the schools declared that they wished to remain true their founding mission, which was to provide advanced training in Arabic and the classical Kitab Kuning. In the mid 1772, there were still a good number of pesantren like Lirboyo, which provide no instruction in non-religious subject, known as pesantren salaf, religion-only boarding school, as opposed to pesantren khalaf or mixed curriculum pesantrens. These schools attracted students from traditionalist background who hope to pursue private non-governmental career in such religious fields as preaching, teaching, or jurisprudence. Officials from the two ministers responsible for coordinating state educational program, the Ministry of Educational and the Ministry of Religion, recognized that in training advanced scholars in the Islamic science, pesantren Salaf provide an important service to the Muslim community. The ministries that thus resolved not to interfere in the pesantren Salaf affair, allowing the educational markets to decide this school fate. By the mid 1990s, larger pesantrens that had early accommodated general education, like the pesantren Tebu Ireng in Jombang, reopened special program for students who wish to pursue religion-only Salaf program of study. The growing interest in Salaf education is not a sign of anti-modern conservatism, nor less of a surging radicalism. Studies of Salaf school and my own visit over the years confirm two remarks of Jakarta-based educator that in matter of pedagogical technique, the largest pesantren Salaf tend to be only slightly more conservative than their Khalaf counterparts. Indeed, many make ready use of computers, video, CDs for language study, and even the internet. Rather than reflecting a fundamentalist turn in Islamic education, then the revival of Salaf education reflects to cultural developments specific to the religious marketplace. The first is the growth in piety among the Muslim public as a whole. Among its myriad social effects, this resurgence has given rise to a marked expansion of interest in classical Muslim scholarship and Islamic tradition of knowledge. One ancillary expression of this interest is since Indonesia booming market in Islamic publishing, one segment of which has made classical works of Islamic scholarship broadly available in Indonesia translation. The second and equally important influence on the small Salaf revival has been the availability of a new employment opportunities for classically trained scholars, especially those with a gift for preaching.
Schooling as social movements. Viewed from this larger perspective, Indonesia's Islamic schools bear an at least partial resemblance to the social movements to which political theories have turned their attention in recent years. In Sydney, terrace of side press, social movements are collective challenge based on common purpose and social solidarities in sustained interaction with elites, opponents, and authorities, and seeking a fundamental change in existing institutions, and hierarchies. Much social movements literature implies that the state is the primary target of movement-leveraged change. However, there is no reason to assume that all social movements are state-centric in orientation. As with movements in other religious traditions, Islamic social movements tend to be as much concerned with changing citizen and society as they are calling the state. The parallel between social movements and Islamic schooling is even more striking when one looks at the way in which religious school creates social organization and cultural frames for perceiving and reforming the social order. Here again, a brief theoretical aside is in order. Social movements theory arose in reaction to strain and grievance. Explanation of protest movements in political sociology. These were regarded as flawed in two ways. First, strain theories assume that the mere presence of injustice or tension in society was sufficient to generate protest movements. And second, in emphasizing a unitary social psychology, strain theories seem to imply that the actors who join social movements are more stressed out than rational, seeking compensatory release rather than an effective instrument for mobilization and change. Social movements theories respond to strain theories presupposition by pointing out that injustice and grievance abound in all societies, but they don't everywhere give rise to organized social protest. The creation of the latter depends on social processes far less automatic than strain theories had implied. In particular, theories argued the emergence or social movement depends on three conditions: the existence of social network through which actors can communicate and mobilize, opportunity structure in political society that provide openings through which the mobilization can move without incurring repression, and last but not least, leaders capable of formulating cultural frames that resonate with popular grievance, inspiring people to join the social movement. The most notable example of moderate social movement schools of this latter sort are those associated with what has come to be known in recent years as the Integrated Islamic School, Sekolah Islam Terpadu movement. Integrated schools are part of a multi-stranded educational movement that, to the surprise of many, become one of the fastest growing trends in Islamic education in the post-Suharto era. The PKS and the Integrated Islam School movement. The first principle of integrated Islamic education is that, rather than confining religious instruction to one or two subject modules, it should be woven into all subjects across the entire school day. In today's Indonesia, the curricular implementation of the integrated education ideal usually proved to be somewhat less ambitious than one may at first expect. The majority of integrated Islam schools cater to the Muslim middle class and lower middle class, and they base most of their curriculum on modules prepared by the state ministries of education and religion. They do so not because of direct government pressure pressures, but because many of their students hope to go on to college, and college admission requires test mastery of the national curriculum. The integration of religious themes into the general curriculum nonetheless does make a difference in both the style of teaching and the school atmosphere. Since the fall of the Suharto regime, hundreds of integrated Islamic schools have sprung up, most of them in urban and suburban areas. The two fastest growing networks are those associated with two groups of a moderate Islamist persuasion, the Prosperous Justice Party (PKS) and the Hidayatullah movement. The PKS network is the larger of the two. The PKS is a center-right party similar in organization and ambition to Turkey Welfare Party and is successor the AK Justice Party. The PKS approach differed from the top-down and immediatist take favored by militant Islamists in the Crescent and Stars Party (PBB) and the Indonesian Council of Mujahideen (MMI). It is this moderate Islamist organization then from which the larger current in the integrated school movement emerged in the early 2000s. Each of the schools in this network is locally financed and formally independent from the national PKA's leadership. However, directors at most schools are happy to acknowledge that they are informally tied to the PKS. Schools vary, however, in the degree to which they encourage or require staff to affiliate with the PKS. The directorship of the six schools that I visited in 2005 and 2006 did not advertise their ties to the PKS, but parents and older students were well aware of the high regard in which faculty held the party. Education against nation. As with those associated with the Persatuan Islam persists Islamic unity, since the early decades of the 20th century there have always been Muslim educators who taught that nationalism is antithetical to Islam. Although Persian schools were careful not to endorse violence, most remains resolutely opposite to nationalism as the basis of the state. Today there are dozens of schools in South Sulawesi, Central Java, parts of Sumatra, and especially West Java operated by individuals once linked to the DI movement. However, the great majority of the schools have long since accommodated themselves to the Indonesian state and nationalism. Indeed, some, like the enormous Al Zaitun Pesantren in Indramayu, West Java, have long since modernized their curricula, forget cordial ties with government ministries, including the Department of Religions, and transformed themselves into ardent supporters of the Indonesian nation. Nonetheless, a smaller network of schools sympathetic to the DI's founding radicalism maintains itself over the long years of the new order. Horn of a dilemma: Muslims, educators, and the Shari'a. The larger question raised by the phenomenon of social movement school is just what the attitude of the majority of educators is one question like democracy, pluralism, non-Muslims, and women. In an effort to answer these questions, in January 2006, the author worked with staff at the Center for the Study of Islam and Society (PPIM) at the Hidayatullah National Islamic University in Jakarta to carry out a survey of 940 Muslim educators in 100 madrasah and Islamic boarding schools in 8 provinces in Indonesia.
The second column of the table below summarizes the data that dealt with Muslim educators' attitudes toward democracy and the Shari'a. The first column presents data from a near identical survey of 1,000 members of the general Muslim public in 8 regions across Indonesia. Muslim attitude on democracy and Islam. Survey 2004 is based on a survey of 1,000 members of the general Muslim public in 8 provinces across Indonesia. 2006 data are based on a survey of 940 Muslim teachers in secondary level Islamic school, is madrasah and pesantrens in 8 provinces. You can see the first table is 7% who agree with the following statement. There is 7 statements who support for democracy. And the second table is a percentage who agree with the following statement about support for Shari'a and Islamism. The survey data reveal several striking facts, the most interesting of which concern the Muslim public's and educators' views of democracy and Sharia. On one hand, an impressive 71% of the Muslim public and 85% of Muslim educators agree that democracy is the best form of government for Indonesia. Equally striking, neither the public or the educator support for formalistic of based on crudely majoritarian understanding of democracy. Rather, the public and the educators' views extend the subtle matters of civil rights, including support for the equality of all citizens before the law, no matter what their political persuasion, citizen freedom to join political organization, legal protection for the media from arbitrary government action, and the nation that open party competition help to improve the performance of government. The second row of figures on the public and the educator support for aspect of the Shari'ah is equally shrinking. Notwithstanding the strength of their commitment to democracy, 72% of is equally of the public and educators believe the state should be based on the Quran and Sunnah and guided by religious experts. A full 75% of the public and 82% of educators think the state should work to implement the Shari'ah. Public support for the Shari'ah wobbles on a few issues. It dropped to 38% for the general public and 59% for the educators, with regret the amputation and thief hand. It also falls with regard to the government effort to require performance of the Ramadan fast. On this matter, at least some educators and even more of the general public appear have second thought about too strict implementation of the law. This data provided a glimpse into a serious cultural dilemma for Indonesian Muslims. The Muslim public and educators started commitments to democracy. Right of political association and press freedom are about as strong as anywhere in the democratic world. However, where a democratic principle runs up against an issue on which the Shari'a and its interpreter have something important to say, the majority of people feel that piety requires that they revert to conventional understandings of the Shari'a. This different result in judgments that many observers, including most Muslim Democrats, would regard as inconsistent with democracy. The survey data suggests two other conclusions. One hand, the Muslim public's commitment to democracy bears witness to one of the most remarkable changes in Muslim political culture in modern times. The fact that growing number of Muslims see democracy as compatibility with Islam and as vital for good government. Here is a culture globalization or far-reaching political importance, but one often overlooked in discussion of modern Muslim politics. Second, and somewhat less brightly, the public's commitment to democracy appeared to exist in uneasy tension with an almost equally strong commitment to the Shari'a. In conclusion, in an article published in 1690, a young anthropologist called Clifford Great surveyed the state of Islamic education in Indonesia, directing his gaze toward the pesantren and the figure or its director, known in Java as Kiai. Great observed that the rise of nationalism in Indonesia had displaced many traditional religion leaders, a create of dangerous gap between the country's new secular nationalist leaders and a citizenry still largely absorbed in a plurality of district regions culture. Indonesia Islamic schools have taken giant steps to bridge the gap between general and religious education. They have built bridge between Islamic and non-Islamic higher education, in the process creating one of the world's finest Islamic university system. There are unresolved tension in Indonesian Muslim politics and education. We catch a glimpse of those tensions in mainstream educators. Unhesitating commitment of both democracy and the Shari'a. The commitment to Islamic law, of course, has to be balanced against the fact that in the voting both most Muslim and the most Muslim educators continue to lend their support to political parties supportive of the multi-religious ideals of Indonesia nationalism. Here is a counter current that will continue to pulse through Muslim politics and culture for years to come. Of course, this prognosis leaves the precise nature of Muslim politics in tomorrow's Indonesian unclear, but it hints at another, no less important trend. This one in the educational field. It's that Muslim school will remain central to effort to resolve the tensions of modern Muslim politics and culture in the peaceful and forward-looking way. In other words, contrary to what we heard a generation ago, Islamic school will not be pushed to the margin of the modern Muslim. This is the end of the presentation. If you have any suggestion, I will be glad to know that. Thank you very much for your attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.